The story begins with an airplane bravely battling a terrible storm that clearly hadn't checked the weather forecast. Our main character, Chuck, was sitting quietly and minding his own business on the toilet when suddenly the cabin pressure dropped. This rudely flung the bathroom door open, ignited a spontaneous fire in the cargo hold, and triggered a dangerous explosion. Realizing an emergency landing was required, the pilot practically shoved Chuck back into his seat. He then handed him a deflated life raft and yelled at him to buckle up. The plane immediately began a rapid, stomach-churning descent, plummeting at about 3,000 meters above the ocean. Chuck suddenly panicked, not about his impending doom, but because he realized the precious pocket watch his girlfriend had given him was missing. The cherished watch had simply fallen onto the floor. The pilot ordered him to put on a life jacket, but it was sitting stubbornly out of reach on the right side of the cabin. Risking it all for the timepiece, Chuck, who was briefly possessed by the spirit of a guy named Jack, foolishly unbuckled his seatbelt and stumbled after it. Just as he grabbed the watch and lunged for the jacket, the plane's angle violently shifted, pinning him in place like a bug on a windshield. The pilot, realizing Chuck had vacated his seat, heroically but questionably unbuckled his own safety belt to help. Unfortunately, a powerful jolt from the turbulence tossed the pilot around, severely injuring him. Despite this, the pilot miraculously managed to crash land the plane somewhat slowly onto the ocean's surface, but the awkward landing angle immediately caused water to flood the cabin. Ironically, Chuck's life was spared precisely because he wasn't wearing his safety belt, allowing him to avoid getting trapped in his sinking seat. Suddenly, the upper fuselage of the plane burst open, and angry seawater began rapidly filling the interior. Luckily, Chuck was still death-gripping the inflatable raft. As he deployed it, however, a tether attached to the raft rudely snagged on a piece of the plane. The doomed aircraft stubbornly decided to drag Chuck and his yellow rubber lifeboat down into the abyss with it. But Lady Luck was on Chuck's side. The stubborn rope snapped under the pressure, allowing the buoyant raft to yank him right out of the jaws of death. Finally, Chuck burst through the surface of the sea, gasping for air and relatively in one piece. With the grace of a wet noodle, he used every last ounce of his strength to flop onto the slippery raft. He clung to the edge for dear life, vowing to hold on until his very last breath. Of course, his floating sanctuary slowly began to drift toward the massive, terrifyingly still-running jet engine. Seeing this horrific blender of doom approaching, Chuck employed the flawless survival tactic of tightly squeezing his eyes shut. Right on cue, the engine caught fire and exploded, unleashing a blast wave that rudely hurled him right back into the salty sea. With a final dramatic rumble, the entire plane slowly surrendered to the ocean. But Chuck's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day was far from over. Our hero now had to face not only the unrelenting fury of the sea storm, but also colossal, skyscraper-sized waves crashing down one after another. He opted for the highly technical strategy of just holding on really, really tightly to the life raft's rope. Who knows how much agonizing time passed before, with the sad hissing sound, the life raft suddenly started losing its air. Some very inconsiderate, sharp coastal rocks had torn a hole in his only floating friend. However, this puncture came with a silver lining. It meant he had finally reached the shore. Mustering the absolute dregs of his strength, he dragged the deflating raft onto the solid ground of the beach. The next morning, as the bright sun practically sunburned his face awake, he realized two things. He was miraculously alive, and he had washed up on a small, deserted island. Yet, even after outsmarting the Grim Reaper multiple times, he felt zero relief, entirely unsure of what fresh nightmares this unknown land had waiting for him. Taking a stroll down the beach, he started casually picking up scattered packages and debris from the doomed plane. He ventured inland, desperately searching for any other traumatized crash survivors like himself. But as he looked around, his only greeting was the deafening, unhelpful sound of endless silence. It quickly became dreadfully clear that he was stranded on a tiny speck of rock that probably didn't even exist on a world map. Was anyone out there, he wondered? He began brainstorming various genius ways to save himself, highly motivated by a strong desire not to die trapped in a tropical prison. At that moment, however, his grandest, most effective rescue strategy was simply drawing a massive help sign in the sand. Soon night fell, and he sat there foolishly hoping a passing boat with excellent night vision might magically spot him. But as the pitch-black night wore on, the eerie, all-encompassing silence turned his optimistic hopes into shivering fear. He trembled in the dark, his overly active imagination convincing him that every snapping twig was one of the jungle's most ferocious flesh-eating creatures. Surviving to see the next day, he built a pathetic but functional makeshift shelter from his scavenged treasures and began sifting through the washed-up luggage. He quickly realized he had basically nothing useful for survival, except that fateful pocket watch his girlfriend had given him. Thinking nostalgically about their sweet moments together, he deeply regretted ever stepping foot onto that stupid airplane. In fact, right before he had left for his ill-fated business trip, his girlfriend Kelly had given him this very watch, promising they would marry upon his return for Christmas. Unfortunately, plummeting from the sky into the ocean tends to put a major damper on wedding wedding plans. Even though all his family members surely assumed he had perished in the accident, Chuck was stubbornly, irritatingly alive. However, securing food and water quickly became a glaring issue on this deserted island, and it was anyone's guess how long he would last before becoming crab food. He had collected several waterlogged parcels belonging to his company's clients, but he virtuously decided not to open them out of deep respect for professional integrity, because clearly, corporate rules still apply when you're marooned. Even though he was hopelessly stranded on an unknown island at the edge of the world, he absolutely refused to break his customers' trust. Meanwhile, the desperate help sign he had proudly scrawled on the beach yesterday had been rudely erased by the high tide. Sighing, he had to use some damaged driftwood to spell out help all over again. Despite the setbacks, Chuck's stubborn desire to survive was gradually growing into an obsession. He logically concluded that if he ever wanted to get out of this tropical nightmare, he actually had to survive it first. But on this desolate little piece of paradise, he couldn't find anything edible except rock-hard coconuts. And since he lacked any tools, trying to crack one open felt like trying to disarm a bomb with a spoon. Indeed, getting a simple snack had officially become the most difficult task of his life. Then he finally managed to crack the stubborn coconut with a sharp stone and eagerly tasted its water, which at that moment tasted like sweet nectar to him. But his rumbling stomach wasn't entirely satisfied with just a meager coconut drink. To truly satisfy his hunger, Chuck decided to boldly explore the other mysterious parts of this tiny island. He ambitiously wanted to climb the highest peak and see everything his new sandy kingdom had to offer. Unfortunately, the incredibly sharp rocks made his barefoot hike painfully difficult. So, in a stroke of fashion genius, he cut some fabric from his pants using a stone, padded it with leaves, and crafted a highly questionable pair of shoes. But when he finally hobbled his way to the top of the mountain, he shockingly realized that it was indeed a completely deserted island. The endless sea stretched far and wide in every direction, but he couldn't spot a single living soul. Just as he began to despair, wondering how on earth he could save his own life, a strange object bobbing in the distance suddenly caught his attention. Without thinking twice, he scrambled down to the beach and ran wildly toward it. He optimistically thought it was the other pilot who had miraculously survived the crash just like him. But when Chuck pulled him ashore and got a closer look, he grimly found that the poor pilot had been dead for quite some time. With a heavy heart and a slightly guilty conscience, he dragged the pilot's body further onto the island and respectfully searched his pockets for anything useful. He slowly began gathering the deceased man's soggy belongings. He kept a pair of shoes that were miraculously still wearable, a waterproof flashlight that still worked, and a waterlogged, worn-out wallet. Acting as the island's premier undertaker, he then dug a shallow grave for the pilot, respectfully buried his body, and inscribed a makeshift tombstone with his death date on a rock. Later that evening, Chuck sat silently on the beach, staring blankly at his newly acquired dead guy shoes. A profound, strange sadness completely filled his lonely heart. He morbidly thought that perhaps the very next person to end up in a sandy grave like that would be himself. Unsurprisingly, that cheerful thought was exactly why Chuck couldn't sleep a wink that night. He clearly understood that if he just continued to sit around feeling sorry for himself, he would definitely die. And so, his mind was firmly decided. The very next day, he officially began his crash course in the harsh art of jungle survival. He painstakingly collected morning dew from the leaves of trees and stored it in a coconut shell, simply because a man desperately needs clean water to drink. Channeling his inner caveman, he aggressively sharpened a wooden stick and fashioned a spear to catch fish. Even though his early attempts looked entirely foolish and clumsy, this persistent, stubborn effort kept him from sinking into total despair. That same night, while awkwardly using the great outdoors as his toilet, he suddenly saw a blinking light out at sea. He hurriedly pulled up his pants and shouted as loudly as humanly possible to attract the attention of the passing boat. He felt an overwhelming rush of hope, thinking he would not have to stay on this cursed rock for another minute. He desperately signaled with his dead pilot's flashlight, praying to see if someone aboard would notice his frantic sows. But the vast distance meant that his tiny, faint beam of light was entirely useless. As the ship's light slowly faded from his sight over the horizon, his breaking heart filled with absolute anger and crushing helplessness. Though, as the sun rose the next morning, he eagerly grabbed his torn, deflated raft and paddled madly in the direction the ship had gone, because making a run for it felt like his only remaining hope of escape after weeks of waiting. He simply was unwilling to lose his one shot at rescue just like that. Although he desperately wanted to paddle out and cross the ocean, he was repeatedly and violently defeated by the crashing waves. He mustered his courage countless times to paddle past the surf, but each time the immense force of the sea ruthlessly pushed him back. The giant waves simply treated him like a rubber toy and pushed him right back to shore. Even bruised and battered, he still stubbornly refused to give up. He tried one last, desperate push, but a massive wave finally engulfed him and flipped his pathetic raft entirely. As he violently tumbled into the water, his leg suddenly struck a hidden coral reef, and a blinding pain seared through his now bloody thigh. At that miserable moment, swallowing half the ocean, he had absolutely no strength left to continue the fight. Limping and cursing, he simply dragged the broken raft back to the sandy shore in a truly terrible, battered state. As if things couldn't get any worse, a sudden thunderstorm and torrential rain began in the evening, further compounding poor Chuck's already agonizing ordeal. With the remnants of the yellow raft, he could only manage to cover the precious, undelivered company packages to keep them dry. Then, dragging his heavily bleeding leg, he pitifully searched for another place to shelter himself from the freezing rain. He eventually found a cramped, damp little cave and drank a few sad sips of dirty rainwater just to keep himself conscious. Almost completely exhausted from his fight with the ocean, his injured body could bear the torment no longer, and he unceremoniously collapsed on the hard, rocky ground. Adding insult to injury, the flashlight rolling behind him finally ran out of battery, and he was completely plunged into pitch-black darkness. The next day, Chuck woke up groaning, once again greeted by the severe throbbing pain in his leg. Disgustingly enough, the nasty wound on his leg already showed horrifying signs of a potential maggot infestation. Being trapped in this desolate, doctor-free place meant things were getting serious. He knew that if the infection wasn't treated immediately, he would soon face an even greater, deadlier danger than a plane crash. To find even the slightest hope of medical supplies or survival gear, he finally had to give up his strict corporate stubbornness and decided it was time to open the FedEx parcels. Among the mysterious packages, he hilariously found a dozen useless VOS videotapes, a volleyball decorated as a birthday gift, a beautiful woman's long mesh dress, and a pair of ice skates that looked incredibly stylish but entirely useless for a tropical beach. However, driven by some strange inner loyalty, he decided not to open the very last parcel. Perhaps he didn't open it because he didn't want to be disappointed by another useless item, or perhaps he just wanted to keep a small, unopened box of hope for himself. He eagerly opened the remaining cardboard parcel to see what else he could use. He creatively applied the soft foam used in the packaging of a t-shirt to pad his nasty leg wound. Then, untying his newly acquired shoelaces, he tightly bound the foam to make a highly fashionable makeshift bandage. The sharp steel blades of the ice skates quickly became his most useful cutting tools, and from the black mesh of the woman's long dress, he brilliantly fashioned a simple but effective fishing net. With the help of his fabulous new fishing tackle, he was finally able to catch and eat a full, satisfying meal for the first time in many agonizing days. However, to make the slimy, raw seafood slightly less difficult to swallow, Chuck confidently decided he was going to start a cooking fire by rubbing two pieces of wood together. But even though he furiously rubbed the sticks continuously from morning till evening, and then exhaustingly from evening till the next morning, the roaring campfire that was in his mind still remained a mere fantasy. He only managed to produce a tiny, pathetic spark, but it never caught on to become the blazing fire he'd so desperately hoped for. His blistered hands were deeply bruised from all the frantic rubbing, and fresh blood began flowing from his torn skin, which completely inflamed Chuck's already boiling anger. The unrelenting hardships of the island, combined with his painful old injuries, had finally and completely shattered his sanity. Chuck sat miserably on the shore and tried to clean his bleeding hands with salty seawater, but the sharp, stinging pain only brought back even more agonizing misery. Now, the grim question of whether he could actually survive this place was a reality he simply couldn't escape. In his earlier tantrum, he had violently thrown the volleyball, which now lay innocently at his feet with his fresh, bloody red palm print shining brightly on its white leather. He stared closely at what the blood mark was doing. Then, a wonderfully strange and slightly crazy idea popped into his completely isolated mind. He used a bit of his own saliva to wipe away some blood, carving two eyes and a slight friendly smile right into the red palm print on the ball. Like absolute magic, the branded volleyball now looked exactly like a little, bloody human face. Perhaps because of his extreme, mind-numbing loneliness, Chuck decided right then and there to make this inanimate face his new best friend. He creatively named the volleyball Wilson after its brand name, and kept it faithfully by his side so that it could keep him company in his miserable new life. The sight of a grown man chatting with sports equipment was undeniably a bit strange, but at least he didn't feel so dreadfully alone anymore. Under Wilson's quiet, unblinking watch, Chuck actually seemed to regain his lost mental strength and determination, as he rapidly and aggressively cut into the firewood once more, and as he continued to furiously grind the stick down, bright, glorious sparks literally flew between the pieces of wood. Chuck was absolutely overjoyed to finally see a real, burning fire, celebrating wildly as if he'd just won a major world war. This glorious fire was not only an excellent cooking scheme for his crab dinners, but also a brilliant way to send a smoke signal that he was actually alive and stranded there. That night, while comfortably eating his freshly cooked meal, he casually discussed his dire situation with his silent, round companion, Wilson. According to Chuck's very rough, sandy calculations, his plane had traveled wildly off course by more than 4,000 miles before crashing. This grim math meant that even if someone desperately wanted to find him, the chances of searching the right area were almost statistically impossible. But now, Chuck really had no other choice but to accept his sandy fate. He simply decided to focus on strengthening himself and staying alive by any means necessary. Unfortunately, months of eating tough food and accidental dirt had caused his already damaged tooth to swell up and become horribly infected. Finally, the excruciating, unbearable pain made him resolve to play dentist and brutally remove it himself. He terrifyingly placed the ice skate blade directly on the rotting tooth with one hand and gripped a heavy stone as a makeshift hammer in the other. He bravely reasoned that a single, blinding moment of agony was much better than a long, drawn-out eternity of toothache. Then, with a mighty whack of the stone, he knocked the tooth right out of his skull. Years passed, and despite becoming an absolute expert at primitive jungle survival, Chuck's eyes no longer held the same hopeful spark they once did. Within 4 long years, Chuck had completely transformed into a sun-baked, bearded wild man. Although he never lacked a seafood dinner because he was now a ninja-level expert at spearfishing, he slowly stopped actively yearning for the modern life he had lived before. His hope of rescue had almost entirely vanished into the ocean breeze. He realistically no longer held any hope of a magical escape, and each day he lived was just another repetitive day of surviving in total loneliness. But after a while, his luck shifted when he found a large piece of sturdy tin debris near the edge of a cliff and excitedly dragged it down to the beach. As the strong sea breeze caught the piece of tin and nearly blew it over like a sail, a brilliant idea suddenly struck him. If he could use this large sheet as a windsail to cut through the brutal, crashing waves, he might actually have a fighting chance to escape the island's watery prison. Once this genius escape plan struck his bearded head, he didn't waste a single moment longer. He was absolutely done finding himself stuck on this deserted island. He realized he had to build a raft and get out of here as soon as physically possible before he started talking to coconuts too. Fueled by newfound hope, Chuck immediately sprang into heavy-duty construction action. As things first, he had to build a proper, wave-defying boat. He gathered a massive bunch of sturdy tree trunks and heavy branches, painfully hauling them all together on the beach. Then, using every stray vine and makeshift rope he could find, he tightly lashed them all together into a floating platform. He even unspooled the discarded VHS videotape, ironically using miles of useless movie film as extra binding rope. However, the stress of the impending escape meant Chuck's already fragile mental state was deteriorating a bit. He bizarrely began to feel that Wilson the volleyball was judging his boat-building skills and stubbornly refusing to let him leave the island. That silly paranoia is exactly why he got into a screaming match with a piece of sporting goods that very night. "I can't just sit here and talk to you for the rest of my life, did you hear me, you cheap volleyball?" he yelled like a madman. He then angrily grabbed Wilson, who had essentially become his adopted 4-year-old son, and chucked him completely out of the boat in a fit of rage. He literally kicked his best friend and threw him away into the dark night. But of course, when his temper finally cooled down a little while later, he felt a deep, crushing remorse for abusing his loyal friend Wilson. So, crying like a baby, he frantically set out in the pitch-dark night to find Wilson, rescue him, and lovingly repaint his fading, bloody face. After a few more days of such dramatic highs and lows, Chuck's heavy wooden boat was finally complete and ready for its maiden voyage. He loaded up his water coconut shells and had everything perfectly ready to go. Now, all he had to do was sit on the beach and patiently wait for the right seasonal wind to help launch his heavy raft out to sea. Before leaving, he even carved a permanent sign into the rock face, proudly indicating his years of stranding, just in case anyone ever visited. He boldly claimed he had spent what felt like more than 10,500 agonizing days stranded on this merciless island. He figured he had definitely set some sort of miserable, unofficial world record for extreme tropical survival. Just as he was dramatically carving the very last letter of his message, the perfect offshore wind suddenly began blowing strongly in Chuck's favor. Trembling with excitement, he pushed the heavy boat out into the turbulent sea and set out in search of civilization, accompanied by his trusty old friend Wilson. The terrifying crash of the waves was exactly the same as before, but this time, the ocean couldn't stop his iron will from returning home. Towering over him like moving mountains rather than the gentle waves of a lake, each massive swell nearly drowned him. But using his tin sail, he furiously kept trying, bravely cutting right through the roaring waves. With each terrifying moment he successfully escaped death, the exhilarating thrill and joy of an actual escape grew stronger within him. When a soaked and exhausted Chuck finally broke past the surf and looked back at the tiny green island that had held him captive for 4 long years, a strangely bittersweet feeling filled his heart. He realized that had he not finally dared to face the hardship of the surf, he would still be trapped there, living a pathetic life of eternal loneliness. However, his epic battle against Mother Nature had actually only just begun. Little did he know that the open water dangers that still awaited him would quickly prove to be his most deadly challenge yet. Just when he naively thought it would be smooth sailing to a human settlement, another ridiculously fierce ocean storm violently shook his fragile raft. The terrifying night, a brutally strong, howling storm swept directly over his tiny wooden vessel. The blinding, stinging wind made it completely impossible to even open his eyes in the torrential, pouring rain. He just lay there totally helpless as the raft pitched in the giant waves, clutching onto the lashed logs for dear life and simply enduring the watery onslaught. It was easily the longest, wettest, and most difficult night he had ever experienced in his entire life. Completely helpless against the ocean's fury, he strapped himself down and nervously left everything up to God. Fortunately, Chuck's guardian angel was working overtime, and he got extremely lucky. Even the fierce storm that night didn't completely wash him away, but his boat was left severely damaged, and tragically, his old friend Wilson had somehow been separated from the raft due to a single treacherous loose rope. By the time a groggy Chuck finally woke up and realized this horrible fact, poor Wilson had already been swept quite far away by the bobbing waves. The silent volleyball was the only true companion he'd had for years. He was the one person Chuck had vulnerably shared all his deepest, darkest feelings with. Even though Wilson was technically just a piece of sporting goods, he had been Chuck's only emotional support system. Forgetting logic, safety, and everything else, Chuck desperately jumped right off his raft into the vast sea and frantically tried to swim out to save his round friend. But the watery distance between them was just too great, and the horrifying realization of drowning in the deep sea pulled at his survival instincts again and again. On one side drifting away was his only lifeboat, and on the other bobbed Wilson, his loyal therapist of 4 years, but realizing he was about to lose his own life, he had no other option but to turn back. Swimming back to the safety of the logs, he simply watched in absolute agony as his dear old friend slowly drifted away before his tear-filled eyes. "Wilson, I'm sorry, please forgive me," he sobbed pathetically into the ocean. And just like that, he tragically lost his only true friend, and once again, an overwhelming tide of loneliness and absolute helplessness engulfed him completely. He was completely surrounded by nothing but endless, mocking blue water. Looking down at his sad wooden boat, which was now almost completely broken, and staring out at the vast ocean surrounding it, a sunburned Chuck finally realized that he might never actually be able to return home. His fierce desire to live, that had only recently awakened within him back on the beach, was now completely, utterly shattered. Finally, defeated and exhausted, he threw away his makeshift oars and decided to simply lie down and wait quietly for the sea to inevitably swallow him up. But just then, exactly as Chuck grimly prepared himself to face an aquatic death, a loud ship's whistle echoed into his ears, a beautiful, mechanical sound he had previously only heard in his wildest dreams. Even though he was utterly hopeless and delirious just seconds before, he mustered every last, tiny bit of his remaining strength to lift his head and turn around, only to see a massive, glorious cargo ship floating right in front of him. Luckily, someone on the giant ship actually saw a crazy man floating on a pile of twigs. And so, after 4 agonizing years of island hardship, Chuck was finally rescued, boarded a luxury plane, and triumphantly returned home. Naturally, his unbelievable story of returning from the dead safe and sound instantly made him incredibly famous throughout the entire city. But quite frankly, none of this newfound celebrity status mattered a single bit to Chuck. He simply wanted to run right over and see his beloved girlfriend Kelly, whom he hadn't laid eyes on in 4 very long, lonely years. But he was absolutely shocked to his core when he knocked on her front door and, instead of his beautiful girlfriend, some random man answered it. Chuck just stood there, awkwardly frozen on the welcome mat. The stranger politely but brutally delivered the punchline to Chuck's tragic joke, stating, "I'm Kelly's husband." The man introduced himself as Jerry, and he clearly wasn't loving this incredibly awkward porch reunion. Chuck felt a massive punch to the gut as he fully realized that the wonderful woman he'd spent 4 years missing was now happily married and even had an adorable little child. Jerry, the new husband, gently calmed a visibly shaken Chuck down, respectfully defending his wife's difficult choices. He softly suggested, "Maybe you should just give her a little more time to process the fact that you aren't actually fish food." With that heavy, heartbreaking reality check, Chuck simply nodded and quietly left their property. Later, after finally getting a chance to see a tearful Kelly face to face, Chuck deeply understood her emotional plight. He maturely knew that moving on with her life was absolutely not her fault, as everyone had legally declared him dead. Let's be honest, if the roles were reversed, Chuck probably would have eventually done the exact same thing. That night, his oblivious FedEx colleagues hosted a massive, fancy feast entirely composed of gourmet seafood as a welcome back present. Huge platters of supposedly delicious, expensive fish and giant steaming crabs were proudly laid out on the banquet table. Staring at the buffet line, Chuck felt something incredibly strange and intensely ironic at that moment. His mind flooded with traumatic raw fish memories of the island, marveling at how the exact same crabs and fish that had been a disgusting daily chore to swallow over there were now being served as highly sought-after, delicious luxury food here. The very next day, acting like the ultimate employee of the month, Chuck drove out to manually deliver that sacred FedEx package he had miraculously never opened on the island, leaving it at its destination with a heartfelt thank you letter attached. In the note, he deeply expressed his sincere gratitude, explaining that the mere symbol of delivering this final package was the hope that had literally saved his life. True to his word, he never actually opened it to find out what incredibly mundane or strange items were hiding inside the cardboard box that had been his quiet companion for so long, and thus, on that poetic note ended this wonderful, salty story. So now it's your turn to tell me, how much did you absolutely love this incredibly long video summary? If the video managed to entertain you in any way, Or if you just liked hearing about a grown man screaming at a volleyball, then definitely go subscribe to my channel, check out my other videos, and be sure to tell me down in the comments which movie's wild explanation you want to see me tackle next.